This is Wavefinder, the dual wavetable oscillator engine for Tonverk. Let's see how it works and how to create sounds like these. But before we dive in, let's first talk about what wavetable synthesis is. A wavetable is a collection of single-cycle waveforms, each with different harmonic content. By scanning through these waveforms, a wavetable oscillator produces continuously evolving timbres. To give you a simplified picture, let's look at this sample loaded on a subtrack. If we play a tiny slice of this sample and loop it, it creates a continuous tone just like an oscillator. By moving the loop position, we move through different parts of the sample's harmonic content, which changes the timbre of the sound. Wavetable synthesis works in a similar way, but instead of moving through a sample, a wavetable oscillator, including Wavefinder, scans through a series of single-cycle waveforms. Now let's switch to Wavefinder. The display shows the single-cycle waveform that is being played. We can scan through the entire wavetable, smoothly morphing between these waveforms to create evolving, rich timbres. So now that we have a basic idea of how a wavetable works, let's take a close look at Wavefinder. To use Wavefinder, download the OS 1.3.0 or later from elektron.se and update your Tonverk. There are 75 wavetables to get you started, included in this OS package. We recommend placing this Wavetables folder in the factory library to keep things organized, as I have done so here. Now let's load Wavefinder. Select a track, hold Function and press Source to access the list of source machines. Select Wavefinder and press Yes. The wave icon above the track number indicates that the machine has been loaded. Now, Wavefinder gives you two independent wavetable oscillators that can be blended. Source page 1 controls oscillator 1, and page 2 controls oscillator 2. Press Source repeatedly or use up and down to toggle the pages. The indicators on the right will help you identify which oscillator you are editing. Now let's assign a wavetable so we can play a sound, starting with oscillator 1. Simply turn knob D to access the project's wavetable pool. Press Yes on an empty slot and it will take us to the SD card's content. Use the arrow keys to navigate to the Wavetables folder. Use the keyboard to preview the wavetables, and even turn the parameter knobs to hear how they affect the sound. Tweaking position is particularly helpful here, as it allows us to hear the entire wavetable while browsing. Once you find a wavetable you like, press Yes to load it to the slot, and Yes again to assign it to the oscillator. To add multiple wavetables to your project at once, hold Function and press Samples to open the sample browser, select SD card, and navigate to the Wavetables folder. Press Yes to select multiple wavetables. See the check marks on the left. Then press Right and select Load Wavetables to add them to your project's wavetable pool. If I go back to the source page, let's go to oscillator 2 and turn knob D, the selected wavetables will appear in this pool. So all we need to do from here is press Yes to assign one to the oscillator. So now both oscillators have a wavetable, and you are hearing a blend of the two wavetable oscillators. Next, let's take a close look at the parameters. On the display, the dotted line at the bottom represents the full range of the wavetable, and the waveform above shows the position and the current wave in the table. Adjusting position lets us scan through the wavetable. Notice how the dot moves along the line and the shape changes as we morph through different waveforms. On the right, we have Slot, where we browse and assign wavetables for the oscillator. Level sets the output level of the oscillator. It allows us to balance the mix between oscillator 1 and 2. Then we have Tune that sets the pitch of oscillator 1, adjustable across 5 octaves. Hold function to get snap values. When we adjust tune, oscillator 1 and 2 move together. So how do we make them play different pitches? That's where detune, found on page 2, comes in. Detune offsets the pitch of oscillator 2 relative to oscillator 1. For example, if oscillator 1 is set to 0, setting oscillator 2 to +7 semitones creates a perfect fifth. If I go back to page 1 and adjust tune now, it will transpose both oscillators while keeping this interval intact. So to recap, use detune to set an interval between the two oscillators and use tune to transpose both oscillators together while maintaining their interval. Aside from tune and detune, oscillator 1 and 2 share the same set of parameters. Let's look at the bottom parameters next. These parameters control the internal modulation. Each oscillator comes with an internal modulator that can affect level and position. Let's test it on this wavetable. Oscillator 2 is muted for now, so we are only hearing oscillator 1. This wavetable starts with a simple sine wave. But if I move the position, the wave becomes richer and more aggressive. To apply modulation to position, increase the depth here where it says animate position. We can now hear and see the position moving every time I trigger the note. Increasing the depth expands the range of movement across the wavetable, starting from the current position. If I move the position a little forward, the modulation will start from that point. It's also possible to set the depth to a negative value, which will subtract the modulation from the current position. Let's use a positive value for now. We can fine-tune the modulation by selecting a shape under animation. There are many shapes to choose from, including one-shot shapes like envelopes and looping shapes like LFOs. We even have the option to use the other oscillator's waveform. The modulation speed is adjusted here on the left. Looping shapes are tempo synced. By holding function while adjusting speed, we can snap to different beat divisions. Modulating the level works in the same way. Set the modulation depth here, where it says animate level, and adjust the level depending on how you want the modulation to work. Hopefully, you now have a good understanding of how the internal modulator works. By combining different wavetables and parameters, you can create a wide range of sounds, making Wavefinder extremely versatile. I'll go through a few sound examples now to show you this in action. Let's start with a simple Reese bass example used in this pattern. Here's a starting point. A set of identical saw wavetables. I'll start off by detuning oscillator 2 by around 15 cents. And we get this classic beating effect, adding thickness and movement. You could also try smaller values around 10 cents. I'll also slightly adjust tune on page 1 to bring the overall pitch down and darken the sound, while keeping the interval between the oscillators intact. Now for position modulation. I'll set both oscillators to roughly the same starting positions. Then I'll apply a triangle loop shape with a positive depth for oscillator 1 and negative depth for oscillator 2, so they move in opposite directions. I'll keep the overall depth subtle and use a slow speed. since too much movement can thin out the low end. And that's it. From here, you could add more modulation or effects, but this is a clean foundation. Next, let's create something more harmonic, like this stacked lead playing chords in this pattern. Here's a starting point. A saw wavetable on oscillator 1, and a metallic FM wavetable on oscillator 2. The exact wavetable choice isn't too important here. I'm just combining two simple waves with different harmonic content to build a harmonized, sustained sound. First, I will detune oscillator 2 to -5 semitones, creating a perfect fourth or an inverted fifth relationship. When playing chords, it can get quite dense, so I'll shape it using level modulation. I'll apply the ramp up envelope shape to oscillator 2's level with a slow speed, and lower the starting level. This way, the harmony phasing gradually rather than hitting all at once. To add more character, let's bring in position modulation. A good approach is to scan the wavetable first and see how the tone changes. In this case, it gets increasingly brighter towards the end. I'll place the start point of oscillator 2 somewhere around here and apply positive position modulation, so the harmony brightens as it fades in. For oscillator 1, I'll add a gentle movement using the triangle loop shape. I'll push the depth, but keep the speed slow for smooth motion. I'll also add a small amount of level modulation alongside position. Moving both together with the same modulator helps exaggerate the movement. To push this further, I've set up subtle position modulation using the track's LFOs. This layers on top of the internal modulation, adding finer movements and making the sound a bit more alive. I've also set up the track envelope on pitch for a subtle bend. To finish this patch, I'll send it to Reverb and insert a low-pass filter FX with slow internal modulation to control the high end. This low-pass filter effect is especially useful since it doesn't use up a track modulation slot in order to add filter movement. In addition, in this pattern, I've added parameter locks on modulation speed and depth to introduce rhythmic variations. All right, next, let's explore something more atmospheric like this pad. Here's the starting point. Oscillator 1 is a little airy and hollow, and oscillator 2 is noisy and more aggressive. Since there's a lot of harmonic variation, I'll use sample and hold modulation on oscillator 1's position, which jumps to different parts of the wavetable each step. Because it is tempo synced, it stays rhythmic while still sounding unpredictable. Let's increase the speed a bit more. Then I'll apply sample and hold modulation to oscillator 2 as well. I'll choose a slower speed. If you want something smoother, you could use the random shape instead, so it drifts more gently. But for this patch, I'll stick with sample and hold for a stepped feel. Next, I'll detune oscillator 2 to plus 19 semitones, creating a compound fifth, and reduce the level with some level modulation. To add more variation, I'll modulate position depth, and modulation speed on oscillator 1. The speed modulation makes the sample and hold steps shift between subtle, slow movement and busy bursts. Adding a more generative feel. Finally, I'll add the low-pass filter effects again with internal modulation and send it to reverb and delay for space. When playing chords, each note gets its own modulation, making the result even more complex. Now let's switch to something a little more percussive like this pluck in the same pattern. Here is the starting point. For this patch, oscillator 2 is the main sound, so I'll start there. Let's mute oscillator 1 for now. To create the pluck, I'll use the ramp down loop shape on level with medium speed and full depth. With the bass level set low, this creates a quick decay, giving us the plucky character. For position, one approach is to set the bass position to a soft part of the wavetable and set the modulation depth so it falls from the brighter part, like this. But in this case, I want to emphasize the softer tone, so I'll do the opposite. Set the bass position close to the brighter part of the wavetable, which is the beginning, and use a positive modulation depth to start each note from the softer tone. However, this reduces the overall energy, so I'll compensate with overdrive. Now for oscillator 1. I'm using a noisy wavetable to add a brightening layer. To keep the oscillators in sync, I'll use the same modulation shape and set the same speed as well to modulate the level. I'll also adjust the starting position. Now, I've set the amp envelope on this track to have a long decay and release, so even short notes take time to trail off, creating a delay-like effect. To finish the patch, I'll add some reverb, insert the low-pass filter effects, and use the LFOs on oscillator 1's position. And tracks pan. For this pattern, I also recorded parameter locks on the modulation speed, adding a bit more expression. And that brings us to the end of the examples. Hopefully, they've given you some ideas to get started with Wavefinder. Before we wrap up, here's one more tip that can open up even more possibilities: using samples instead of wavetables. On a Wavefinder track, turn knob D and press Yes on an empty slot. Choose a sample from the SD card instead of a wavetable. For example, I'll go to Single Samples, Texture, Field, and pick one from here. Let's pick this one and assign it to the wavetable oscillator. Now pitch it down by a few octaves. And you will start to hear the character of the original sample, but with a glitchy textural quality. And you can use all the same tools: tuning, position, and modulation. I tried this with my vocal sample and also a field recording with birds in it. And here's a sketch that I made. So definitely try it out with your own samples and explore what you can create. That's everything for this video. Enjoy Wavefinder and thanks for watching.